So we're talking about prayer. We've been talking about prayer for a while. I'm going to put the candy down, otherwise it'll just be crinkly, crinkly, crinkly. And I'm going to empty out the rest of my pockets. We've been talking about prayer for a while. We're going to keep talking about prayer. I'm going to sit down for a second. And last week, I told a story that I said was only part one of a story, so I'm going to tell the rest of the story today about Walt and Diane Disney. Now, do you know who Walt Disney is? Anybody know who Walt Disney is?
The person that created Disney?
He's the guy who created Disney, yeah. He created Mickey Mouse and a whole bunch of other characters in Disney World. What's that?
Spider-Man.
Nope, that was Stan Lee that created Spider-Man. This is a different guy that created stuff. What's that? Well, Disney bought Spider-Man later, but Stan Lee created Spider-Man. Walt Disney created Mickey Mouse and Goofy and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs movie and all these really cool stuff. The Cinderella movie was really, really neat. They had Peter Pan. Yep. They created the Peter Pan movie. It was really cool. And he had two daughters, Diane and Sharon. Diane was his oldest. How old are you again? 8. And how old are you? 6. Diane was 6 years old when this story took place. And Sharon was younger, a couple years younger than Diane, and wasn't at school yet. But Sharon and Diane, they didn't know. All they knew was that their dad was Dad. They knew his name was Walt, and they knew their last name was Disney, but that's all they knew because they didn't make a big deal out of it at home. They didn't have pictures of Mickey Mouse or any of the other Disney characters at home. They didn't, their dad didn't do all of these big parties like some celebrities do. He'd rather stay home and play with his kids, hang out with his family in the evenings rather than going off to do parties after work. And until Diane went to school, and she was 6 years old. And she went to school, and at school, one of her friends started asking her about her family, including her dad. And Diane figured some things out that she didn't realize before. She went home, and we don't know we know what she said. I don't know exactly how she said it, but I kind of picture her as this 6-year-old girl walking into her dad's office, probably given the way things were in those days, probably had a skirt on and a bow in her hair, put her hands on her hips, and looked at her dad and said, "Daddy, you never told me you were that Walt Disney." That was part one of the story. She didn't know her dad was that Walt Disney. Part two is this. She then asked her dad for an autograph. That's pretty cool. She asked her dad for an autograph. Why do you get someone's autograph? Have you ever gotten someone's autograph? No? Anybody out there? Any of the big people? Why do you get someone's autograph? They're valuable. Autograph can be valuable. You ever get an autograph of someone you didn't care about? You ever get an autograph of someone you didn't know? No. I did once, but I thought he was someone who was famous because he was up front, but he wasn't famous. I got his autograph anyway. Last autograph I got. You get autograph people when they're special to you. And Walt Disney was special because she knew all about that Walt Disney and all of the neat Disney stuff, and she found out that was her dad. And that's like Jesus taught us when he was teaching us to pray. He taught us to pray, "Our Father who is in the heavens," and then he said, pray this way. Pray, and it's kind of old language. You say, "Hallowed be your name." Hallowed just means to make holy. And so Jesus taught us to pray to make God's name holy, kind of like Diane. Well, you don't know this yet, but that's kind of what Diane did when she got her dad's autograph. She was kind of saying her dad's name was holy to her. But before, I got a story I want to tell you. The next story is going to be a much longer story. It's one of my favorite stories. But I want to give a couple of definitions before we get to the big story. And because we're going to talk about the word holy a lot today. So, before we talk about that, we're also talking about name. We're talking about God's name and keeping God's name holy. But what's in a name? What's in the name? My name is Scott. That's just a sound you make. Do you know what my name means? Someone from Scotland. I've never even been to Scotland. I'm not from Scotland. That name doesn't have any meaning for me other than the sound Scott. If someone says it, I look around. That's me. And that's my name. But my name itself doesn't really mean anything. Back in Jesus' day, people's names meant something. In fact, there was a guy that lived a long time before Jesus was born, and his name was Jacob. And he was very special to God, and he was not quite doing the way God wanted him to do. So God came down and became a person and actually wrestled with Jacob. Could you imagine having a wrestling match with God? Who do you think would win if you and God were wrestling? God. Yes, absolutely right. God would win. And that's who won that wrestling match. God wrestled with Jacob, and Jacob was wrestling so hard, God actually had to knock his leg out of joint. That's how hard Jacob was wrestling. And after that, God changed Jacob's name to Israel, which means wrestles with God. So Jacob's name, his new name, Israel, meant what Jacob was. It's the sort of person Jacob was. It told us who he was. It told us about his identity, his character, the kind of person he was. And that's what names meant in Jesus' day. By the way, do you know what Jesus' name means? It means God saves. Yeshua, which was Jesus' name in Hebrew, means God saves. And Jesus was there to save us, to show that God saves. All right? He had another name. Well, I'm not going to get all of that. So names meant something. And so when we're talking about God's name, we're not just talking about don't use God's name as a cuss word. We're talking about God's whole person and his whole identity. When we're talking about keeping that holy, we're talking about keeping God holy. But what does holy mean? Anybody here want to take a guess? Oops, I gave you the answer if you were paying close attention. What does holy mean? Anybody know? You know what? Got to guess what holy means? That's a tough one. Special. It means special. Do you have anything like your most favorite toy?
Yep.
What's your most favorite toy?
Xbox.
Xbox. Do you take your Xbox out and throw it in the grass when it's raining outside? No. Do you take your... Do you use your Xbox as a stool when you want to climb on something to reach it? No. Do you throw your Xbox around like a ball? No. You treat it special. And you play games on it. You use it just for what it's used for. And watch movies, because that's what an Xbox was made to do. Play games and watch movies. And when something is special, you use it just for what it was for. And you take care of it. You take care of your Xbox, right? You don't hit it with a hammer. You don't drop it out the window. You don't throw it down the steps.
You don't throw it off the
You don't. Right. You take care of it. It's special to you. And that's what holy means. And so when Jesus is talking about keeping God's name holy, Jesus is teaching us to treat God as special. And there's two ways we can treat God as special. One is by how we treat God. Are we treating God as special and holy? And how we treat other people. That's the other part of it. How do we treat God and how we treat other people? Are we treating God as special and holy, or do we act like God is just another person? Like, nice opinion, God, but I'm really not going to follow your advice today. That's a great idea, God, but I'm going to do things my own way. You're all right, God, but so this thing over here is really, really cool too. You know? Is God just one of many, or is God special? Special. So the question is, what does it look like to treat God special? And I have a story that I want to tell you. Tell everybody. Huh? What's it? A story about treating God's... Now, it may not sound like that's what the story's about at first. So I'm going to ask you guys at the end, and the big people can participate too. What does this story have to do with treating God as special and being holy? Okay? All right? You ready for that? So listen to the story, then I'm going to ask you a question. It's one of my favorite stories. I did not invent this story. The story's called The Happy Prince, and it was originally written by a guy named Oscar Wilde. I've changed it from his story. His is a really long story. It would take too long, and it would be kind of confusing. So I've shortened it a little bit, and this is one of my favorite stories. And the story is about the Happy Prince. The Happy Prince was a statue at the time the story started. He was a statue in a big city way on the other side of the world, a place called Europe, long way from here. And it was a long time ago. It was before cars, it was before telephones, it was before Xboxes, it was before electricity was being used by people. It was a long time ago, okay? And the Happy Prince was a statue in a garden on the highest hill in a big city. And the Happy Prince was beautiful. He was a beautiful prince. And the leaders of the city, like the mayor of the city and the judge and the bankers of the city, the important people of the city who like to walk around and be important, whenever they passed by the happy prince, they would stop and say, "Ah, our prince is so beautiful and so wonderful and so happy." And he was beautiful and wonderful. He was all covered in gold. He had a sword at his side and a hilt, and it had a big ruby on it, which is a big red gemstone, very precious, very valuable. And his eyes were blue sapphires, big blue sapphires, also precious gemstones, very valuable. And he was all gold. And they would look, "Oh, he's so beautiful and he's so happy." And then they would walk on after they agreed that the prince was beautiful and happy. Well, this city happened to be along the route that some birds called swallows. You ever see a swallow? Swallows are really fun birds to watch. They have tails that are forked. They have forked tails. You've seen swallows. They are very fun to watch. They make a mess. I love having swallows around. Most people don't like having swallows around because they're messy birds. They're messy birds. But they're what?
Are they black, blue, and red?
No.
What?
Nope. They're kind of gray and brownish and white. But swallows, they fly in the air and they play. They're really fun to watch when they're flying and playing in the air. And there were a group of swallows that were flying from way up in the north, and for winter they wanted to go south where it was warm, and they would stop at this city and rest for a while. And one of those swallows was stopped there, and he was resting, and he decided to spend one night there before he flew the rest of the way to Egypt. And he landed, he saw the statue, he saw how pretty it was, and there was a space between the feet of the happy prince that he thought, "That will be a great place for a bed and breakfast. I'm just going to stay here. This will be my Airbnb for the night. I'm going to stay here and spend the night." And he was just drifting off to sleep when plop, a big drop of water hit him. And then another drop of water, and then another drop of water. And the swallow went, "Oh my goodness, the weather is awful in Europe. Even when there's not a cloud in the sky, it still rains. This is terrible. I'm so glad I'm going south to Egypt for the winter." But then he realized it wasn't rain at all. He looked up and he saw that the happy prince was crying. Whoa, a statue crying. That's kind of crazy. And so the swallow flew up and landed on the prince's shoulder, and he said, "Hey, I thought you were the happy prince. Why are you crying?" And the prince said, "Well, I was happy. When I was a real boy, before I died, I lived in the palace. And I lived in the palace, had a big wall around it. And inside the wall, in the garden, everything was wonderful and nice. And I had lots of money, and I had all of my favorite food to eat whenever I wanted it. And I had friends that played with me, and I had wonderful clothes to wear, and a beautiful garden to play in, and a beautiful yard to play in, and wonderful toys to play with. And everything was happy. What I didn't know," said the happy prince, "was that wall was keeping all of the sadness away. And then when I died, and they made me into a statue and put me up on this hill, for the first time, I was able to see all of the sadness in my city. And now, even though my statue on my statue face can't move, and I have to smile all the time, my heart, even though it's made of lead, feels like it's going to break for sadness." And the swallow thought, "Wow, I thought he was solid gold. I didn't know he was just gold on the outside." But the happy prince kept talking. And he said, "Swallow, swallow, little swallow, I'm looking out across my city, and I see a long way away in a very poor neighborhood, there's a woman, and she's a seamstress." Do you know what a seamstress is? A seamstress makes clothing for people. And they didn't have sewing machines back in those days. They had to stitch things together by hand. And there was a seamstress. Then her hands, it was getting cold because winter was coming. And I keep getting black stuff on my hands every time I get out of my car. I don't know where it's coming from. I've got to figure this out. I've washed my hands 3 times today. He said, "There's a seamstress, and it's very cold outside, but she can't afford coal or wood to keep her house warm, or their apartment warm, really, because she doesn't even have a house. And her little son is lying sick. He's got a high fever, and he's lying in the bed, and they don't have any money for medicine. and she's working very hard to sew a dress for the princess for the upcoming ball, but she's afraid she won't get it done in time, and if she doesn't get it done in time, she won't get paid, and there won't be any money to buy medicine for her son. The swallow said, "That's very sad, but there's nothing I can do. I'm flying south for the summer, flying south for the winter tonight." And the prince said, "Swallow, swallow, little swallow, could you stay one more night and take the ruby from the hilt of my sword and carry it down and give it to the woman so she'll have enough money to buy medicine and food and coal for the fire?" And the swallow said, "It's getting very cold, and cold is dangerous for birds like me, but I'll stay one more night and I'll help you." And so the swallow worked at it, and it took him a while, but with his beak, he finally got the ruby out of the hilt of the sword, and he flew with it across the city. And when the seamstress wasn't looking, he flew in through the window behind her, and he dropped the ruby on the table where she was working, and then he flew out quickly. And when the seamstress turned back, she saw a ruby lying there on her table. She said, "Oh my goodness, God has provided a miracle." And she took the ruby and she sold it. And she bought medicine for her son and food for them both and coal to keep their apartment warm. The swallow, he went back to the prince, and suddenly he was feeling warm. And he said, "Well, Prince, I feel warmer than I did before." And the prince said, "You feel warm because that's the feeling of doing a good thing." And so the swallow spent that day flying around and playing and enjoying the sights again. And as evening approached, he came back to the prince and he said, "I'm off to Egypt now. It was nice meeting you, and I hopefully will see you again the next time I'm in town." And the prince said, "Swallow, swallow, little swallow, will you stay with me one more night and help? I'm looking out across my city and I see another apartment in another part of the city, and it's not even really an apartment, it's an attic. And someone has got a small cot up an attic, and he's a playwright, and he's trying to write a play that he thinks the king will love, but he's so cold he can barely hold the quill and write, and he doesn't have money for fire to keep him warm, and he doesn't have money for food to eat, and he's very hungry and he's very cold. Swallow, swallow, little swallow, could you take one of the sapphires that are my eyes and take it to this young man so that he can have food and he can have warmth and he can finish his play?" And the swallow said, "My prince, I have to go tonight. It's getting cold. I need to go south for the winter because cold is bad for birds like me." And the prince said, "Swallow, swallow, little swallow, stay just one more night and do this favor for me." And the swallow said, "But I can't take your eye. How will you see?" And the prince said, "I still have another eye. It'll be okay." So at last the swallow agreed. And he flew up to the prince and he plucked out his sapphire eye and he flew across the city and he dropped it on the desk in front of that man who was so tired and so weak from cold and lack of food, he didn't even notice the swallow. But he felt that gemstone drop onto his hands, and he opened his eyes and he saw it, and he said, "Ah, I must have a patron. There must be someone out there who loves my writing and wants me to continue." And he took the sapphire and he sold it and he finished the play, and the king loved it. But back at the happy prince, the swallow flew, and he was once again warm. And the happy prince said, "That's the feeling you get from doing a good thing." The swallow, the night was almost gone. The swallows flew through the day. And as the evening approached, he came back to the happy prince and he said, "I'm going to Egypt now. I just want to say goodbye. It's been good to know you. Thank you for helping me help your people in this city. God bless you in your kingdom." And the happy prince said, "Swallow, swallow, little swallow, I'm looking out across my city and I'm seeing a little girl, and she's a matchstick girl. Some folks, some little children were sent out by their parents and they had to work. And this little girl's, her parents were very poor. And all she could do, they made matches and she sold matchsticks to make a little money, to make a few pennies. But she dropped her matchsticks in the water and they were all ruined. And her father was a very mean man," said the happy prince. "And if he goes home with no money, if she goes home with no money and no matchsticks, her father will beat her. Swallow, swallow, little swallow, take the sapphire from my other eye and give it to the little girl, so that when she goes home, her father will be pleased and not angry." And the swallow said, "My prince, I cannot take your other eye, you will be blind. And besides, it's getting very cold. There are a few snowflakes falling, and snow is tough for birds like me. I need to go to Egypt, to go south where it's warm for the winter. And the prince said, swallow, swallow, little swallow. Just do this one thing more for me, please. And I promise you can go south for the winter. And so the swallow plucked out the prince's other eye, and he flew across the city, and he dropped it right into the dress pocket of the little girl. And she found it. And she was so pleased. She didn't really know what it was, but when she took it home and showed it to her parents, they were so pleased that she had brought home the sapphire. The swallow flew back, and he landed on the shoulder of the prince, and the prince said, farewell, swallow. Enjoy your time in Egypt. Next year when you come through, you can tell me everything you saw in that wonderful land down there. And the swallow said, my prince, I'm not going to Egypt. You can no longer see your city. I'm going to stay with you, and I will be your eyes, and I will tell you what is happening all over your city. And so the swallow stayed, and he would fly around the city, and he would come back and tell the prince whenever he saw someone that was sad or hurting or in pain or in need. And the prince explained that all of his skin was very thin layers of gold. And whenever he saw someone in need, the swallow would come and peel off a little bit of gold from the prince and take it to the person. Until one day, when the wind was very cold and the snow was very deep, and the swallow flew back and he flew around the prince, and there was no gold left on the prince at all. There was nothing left there. He was just a big iron statue, kind of dull and dreary in the park, with no gems and no gold to give. And the swallow sat on the shoulder of the happy prince. And the prince said, my friend, there's nothing left to give. It's time for you to fly south for the winter. And the swallow said, it's too late for that now. It's too cold, and I'm too tired, and I can't go south for the winter. But it has been so good to be your friend, my prince, and I will always count you my friend. And it got so cold that night that the poor little swallow, sleeping between the feet of the happy prince, he died. And the prince was so sad, that his heart of lead inside his chest just broke. Well, that very next morning, the important people of the city were walking through being important, and the mayor was there, and the judge was there, and the banker was there. And they looked up at the happy prince and they said, my, how shabby the happy prince looks. And the other said, oh my, yes, he's very shabby. He doesn't look happy anymore. And the third one said, oh my, and look, there's a dead bird at his feet. This is awful. This is a disgrace to our city. And they tore the statue down, and they melted it, and they threw it in the rubbish heap along with the dead bird. And the only thing of the prince that they couldn't melt and reuse were 2 pieces of lead from right in the middle. No matter how hot they got the fire, they couldn't get them to melt. So they threw the lead, those broken pieces of lead, on the rubbish heap right next to the swallow. Up in heaven, though, up in the heavens, God was watching. And he said to his angels, do you see that city down there? I want you to fly through the city and bring me the 2 most holy things you could find. And the angels, with their wonderful wings, they went down to the city and they flew back and forth. And of course, they were invisible. The people couldn't see them, but they searched the whole city. And what do you think they brought back to God?
The 2 pieces of lead and the bird.
They did. The 2 pieces of lead and the bird. And they brought them to God, and God said, you have chosen wisely. These indeed are the most holy things in that whole city, the most special things, the most precious things. And God said, this swallow will fly forever and sing and play in the gardens of my kingdom. And the prince will live forever and be happy again in the land of my kingdom. You have chosen wisely. Now, I have a question for you. What made the broken lead and a dead bird, what made them holy? Why were they holy?
Helping themselves.
What's that?
Giving up. There was helping each other and helping other people.
They were helping each other and they were helping other people. And that's exactly what Jesus told us to do and what God has told us to do. He He's told us to love God. The most important thing we can do is to give everything we have to love God. And the second thing is just like it, to love one another, to love other people. So when we love other people, we're loving God. And when we're doing that, that's how we keep God's name holy. By living the way Jesus taught us and showed us to live, by loving God and loving other people. And so when Jesus is teaching us to pray, to keep God's name holy, what he's teaching us to do is to pray every day, God, help me live in a way that other people will know how holy you are. Help me to live like Jesus lived, by loving you and loving other people. And that's what we're praying whenever we pray, to keep God's name holy.